Okay, let's start. An official warm welcome now to everybody to today's Impact for Breakfast session. I'm Deborah Keller and I manage the Global Impact for Breakfast Network, an initiative supported by Artha Impact, the impact investing arm of the Rianka Capital Family Office. Impact for Breakfast is an informal network of family offices, foundations, funds, venture philanthropy, and intermediate organizations with a common focus on social entrepreneurship, social enterprises, and impact investing. This specialized group has been gathering and growing since 2008. We started off in London with a small group of investors, and today expanding to 18 cities around the globe and 2,500 members. Today, we will learn more about Gendersmart thematic investing initiatives from 2X Collaborative and hear about EG Capital's experience building their Gendersmart mandate and why they have chosen health, food, education, and climate resilience as the core investment sectors to achieve their goal of improved economic empowerment for youth and women. I have the pleasure to have with me today Morgan Mandewell, who is going to moderate through the session. Morgan is an impact investment fellow with Innovest Advisory. She has worked in the international economic development space for the last 15 years, spanning both the nonprofit and corporate finance sectors. This is the third session, I think, we are hosting with Innovest Advisory. Innovest is based in Guernsey, Jersey, and South Africa, and it is an impact investment advisory firm which helps its clients to become more intentional about impact and embedded impact into their processes. Innovest works with fund managers, impact investors, and impact enterprises to achieve targeted social and environmental outcomes, bringing extensive experience from the development, climate change, and broader environmental sectors together with capital markets. Also with me today, Sandrine Henton, Managing Director of EG Capital, and Jessica Espinosa, CEO of 2X Collaborative. I will let Morgan introduce our two wonderful speakers a little later. Before we dive into today's session, you might have heard it, we are recording this session. We have planned 1 hour for today's event. The first half an hour will be a presentation interview between our speakers and Morgan, and at the last slot, the 30 minutes, will be a Q&A where you can ask your questions, share your comments or ideas that you would like to share with our speakers. If you can think of a question at any point during the presentation, you can use the chat box and post it there, or unmute yourself during the Q&A and share it directly with our speakers. And now, with no further ado, over to you, Morgan.
Thanks, Deborah. Welcome to all of our participants. I'm excited to be moderating today's webinar. As Deborah said, let me briefly introduce our two esteemed panelists. We have Sandrine Henton, who's the founder and managing director of EG Capital, a Kenyan-based private equity fund focused on investing in medium-sized businesses in health, food, education, and climate resilience across East Africa as well as Zambia. And she has over 15 years experience in strategy consulting and finance, including private equity commercial due diligence with a focus on businesses in the emerging markets. We're also joined by Jessica Espinosa, CEO of 2X Collaborative, a global industry for gender lens investing, convening the entire spectrum of capital providers. Jessica is also chair of the 2X Challenge. And prior to joining the 2X Collaborative, Jessica was vice president for private equity and venture capital investments with the German DEG. Before we get started, I asked Deborah to take a quick poll of the audience. So Deborah, if you could open our polling question.
Of course.
Give our participants a chance to Okay.
10 more seconds.
Yeah.
I think we should have it on. I'll end the polling and share the results with you.
Thanks. You shared the results, Deborah?
Yes. Do you
Okay.
see them?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, well, that's great for the direction we're going to go with this webinar and trying to suss out some of both the fundamentals of thematic investing and also some practical examples, which I think will give the audience a better sense of the topic at play. So Jessica, I think I wanted to start with you today, given your diverse experience in this space. I was hoping maybe you could unpack at a high level this concept of thematic investing, what its drivers are, and how it's different from, say, traditional investing, if you believe that's the case.
Thank you so much, and it's really a great pleasure to be here with you today. So let me start with the latter part of your question. So how is it different? I would say at a high level and in a nutshell, traditional impact investments or impact investing has tended to operate a bit more in silos, whereas thematic investing seeks to consider long-term drivers of growth and also considers who stands to benefit from these drivers of growth, as well as long-term risks. So let me perhaps give you a specific example. Instead of seeing the specific impact focus areas as distinct asset classes or focusing on individual SDGs in their specific SDG boxes, thematic investment and most notably gender lens investing focuses on opportunities across all asset classes and leverages synergies and ripple effects across the various SDGs to unlock the business case and the impact case. Gendersmart climate finance is a great example. We know that inequality and climate change are the twin challenges of our time, and there's a lot of focus on these two thematic impact areas. But in the past, they have been largely tackled in their respective silos, right? So focusing on climate finance or focusing on gender lens or diversity lens finance. However, there's a growing body of research that's really showing this nexus between gender equality and climate action. And this is one of our strategic priorities in the 2X Collaborative, as we are convinced that we cannot achieve gender goals without climate action. And similarly, we cannot achieve climate goals without gender equality. So leveraging investment opportunities at the gender-climate nexus strengthens the business case and the impact case by unlocking these synergies and ripple effects between the two. At the 2X Collaborative, we believe thematic approaches are more likely to unearth innovative, bankable, and investable transactions because these investment approaches leverage major global trends. They break down silos to enable catalytic effects. And they are data-driven, so relying on a strong evidence base. And this also means that data is not an afterthought to measure impact after you've made an investment, but rather that your investment decisions are, and also your ongoing value creation work is based on real-time gender-smart data to inform your decisions.
So thanks, Jessica. So given those mega trends, I think, which you've touched on a couple, both their sectors and themes, are there ones that you're seeing more frequently? I mean, yes, we're talking about gender and climate here today, but when you look at it from global themes, either green jobs or sectors from agri or transport, manufacturing, what are some of the trends that you would like to see more of that are particularly important to the 2X Collaborative? If you could touch on a bit of those. And also, I know that there's a 2X Ignite facility, and maybe the rationale behind that somehow connects to trying to provide finance to explore these global sectors and global themes.
Yeah, excellent question. So definitely, in terms of the trends, definitely gender equality and women's empowerment and climate. But also digital innovation and other forms of inclusive innovation as key trends. And, you can think of, if you think about digital innovation and you mentioned future green jobs. So in general, the future of work and education, I think there's a tremendous opportunity in the education space and connecting, adolescent girls and youth from education to jobs and future jobs. And I know Sandrine can talk more about that. In the health space as well. But I would say in general, like everything around really the future of work, education, digital innovation, and inclusion. Let's take Gendersmart climate finance again as an example. We have a very active gender and climate task force, which has co-created a Gendersmart climate finance toolkit that we launched at COP26 in Glasgow in November. You may have seen the toolkit, it's published on our 2X Collaborative website. And it was really exciting to see the traction at COP26 and the widely shared recognition that we are now moving beyond seeing women as victims of climate change to recognizing them as agents of change, really driving climate action at the front lines. This toolkit features 11 sector-specific and thematic guidance notes. So focusing on a range of sectors. So you have energy, agriculture, manufacturing, infrastructure, financial services, as well as thematic areas like adaptation, mitigation, green jobs, biodiversity. So again, you can really see that it's not one asset class or just zooming in, but really leveraging opportunities across diverse sectors and these cross-cutting thematic areas. For example, green jobs, biodiversity. Now, the 2X Ignite facility that you just mentioned, that is a catalytic facility. And what's really groundbreaking with that is last year we brought together over 120 investment professionals from across emerging markets. Sandrine was part of it, many others across Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia Pacific, and the Americas. And we really brought all of these smart people together to see how can we unlock the ripple effects of gender lens investing. What are the current barriers and biases that are still stopping capital from really flowing at scale towards these impact or these thematic mega trends? And we saw that there are dozens and dozens of really interesting fund managers coming to market. They are led by diverse teams. They have new investment theses that are really focusing on these mega trends. So they have a gender lens. They often have a strong climate lens as well as a focus on these mega trends and thematic areas. But because they are perceived as emerging fund managers or first-time fund managers, with completely new investment approaches and way of looking at investments, we still see some like less capital flowing to them compared to the traditional well-established fund managers that have been around for a few decades. And so 2X Ignite was co-created by bringing together fund managers, so Sandrine and others who brought that perspective, and the LP investors, the fund investors who want to invest in these funds, but currently don't have internally the tools available to see what is really needed to unlock this capital. And so 2X Ignite is a blended facility that has 3 pillars. One is capacity building and shared services. The second one is working capital and warehousing capital to enable these fund managers to demonstrate track record by making the first deals, really showing investors how the strategy plays out in practice, what these ripple effects look like when you actually execute the deals. And then the third one, to connect them with LPs who come in as anchor investors at first close, but also beyond in subsequent closes. And what's really exciting to see is that is this new generation of fund managers that has this thematic focus, and I think a lot of potential to unlock these ripple effects.
Thanks. And actually, Sandrine, it's sort of a double whammy for you, because I know EG Capital has embraced this thematic investment approach, but simultaneously, as a female fund manager, you experience the gender lens investment, I guess, barriers in different ways, both in the work that the fund is doing, but also in your capital raising, et cetera. So I do want to ask you a few questions about that, but maybe to start, building on the landscape that Jessica has provided, and I know that EG Capital, as part of the 2X family, has sought to craft this gender-sensitive, gender-smart, climate-responsive type investment philosophy. It sounds like a mouthful sometimes. And you're doing so specifically by supporting businesses in the space of food, health, education, climate resilience. I guess it would be interesting, I think, for the audience as well as myself, because I know that when we at Innovest started working with your team, we were looking at what the linkages were essentially here. And I guess I was hoping you could talk to a bit why those investments, why these sectors are strategically relevant for gender equality and climate resilience, and sort of how you derive this link to women's empowerment a bit. So sort of somehow setting the stage with your overall investment thesis and approach. And I think, oh, you're sharing a slide. Okay, great. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. No, thank you, Morgan and Jessica. And I think the 2X collaborative provides a lot of support and a lot of research to actually advance the field. So we're benefiting a lot from data and evidence-based approaches that we're then able to kind of also implement in our investments. So I think there's really like a great value in being part of that community. We do focus on health, food, education, and climate resilience. These are our thematic sectors at EG Capital. And yes, we will be looking at generating returns, and these are the recovery sectors in the post-COVID environment. But we look at this enhanced value creation and impact in diversity, gender, economic empowerment for youth and women, and climate. So that thematic of gender and climate is actually cutting through all of our sector investments. And as you can imagine, it sort of fills a significant market gap in terms of young people and women being able to access essential products and services, and to really also show like how we improve livelihood through that. Coming down to why these sectors actually matter for gender and the climate conversation, I think this is an interesting angle, especially when we look at why these sectors matter for climate, for example. So we launched in 2018 in Switzerland Project Drawdown, which looked at a number of scientists who created a list of 100 methods that have the greatest potential to remove or reduce greenhouse gases and to basically draw down climate change. The innovative approach of Project Drawdown meant that it actually also calculated the financial savings that would occur in the long term from delivering these solutions. And this is particularly relevant because, as you know, Jessica mentioned, we tend to see climate and gender in silos, and a lot of the European regulations in particularly look at climate and sort of look at forestry, the energy sector, and climate technology. We tend to forget the social sectors. And when we look at the scientific evidence, we can see that reduce food waste, so food production waste, and how we source proteins is the number 3 and the number 4 solutions to reduce climate change. And when we look at educating girls and family planning, and we combine the two, it's actually the number 1 solution to reduce climate change. So the social sectors are really important for the load they have on climate and for the type of consumer changes that we would need to see. We'll go into a little bit deeper about that shortly after. But effectively, yeah, investing in education, health, and food obviously matters to gender equality greatly. When we look at these sectors, there is an overwhelming percentage of women that are actually working in those sectors. If we look at women farmers, teachers, and nurses, and if we look at who pays the bill, the school fees, the healthcare bills, and the groceries, it is women. So women are really overly represented in those sectors. And they're the main consumer, they're the main value chain participant and decision maker. So we really strongly believe that businesses that understand the economic opportunity of investing in young people and women with much more targeted product and services will do better. And we know that women and young people are the driver of the consumer economy, especially in our markets in Africa. So we work with our portfolio companies to actually improve the workforce participation, improve the financial empowerment of women and young people across the value chain of that company. And there's a number of KPIs that, as Jessica mentioned, is a significant impact and ripple effects within our target markets. Looking at some of the criteria, I think that's also interesting to look a little bit how the 2X criteria were applied in our context as an emerging fund manager. So we look at gender across different areas like entrepreneurship for ourselves as a company. What about, the compositions of the team and gender equity within the team? We look at it obviously also through our investments. When we look at investing in women-owned businesses, we look at the leadership, our own leadership, and the ones where we make investment. And we can greatly influence board representation, women participation in economic decision-making and activity at the portfolio company level as well. We look at employment. As I said, our sectors are showing disproportionately benefit to women. So it's ensuring these ripple effects where the bar is even higher for us in a way, given the sectors in which we operate, and to look at the participation of women in the workforce, as consumer, employees, and value chain participants. Consumption, looking again at access to products and services that are more targeted for women and young people. And looking at ourselves as an intermediary as well, what indirect impact also we're able to create. To give perhaps a more practical example of this nexus between climate and gender, Jessica mentioned the education sector. And indeed, when girls, especially teenage girls, are allowed to stay in school longer, are provided with the right healthcare and family planning products and services and education, they make different choices. They are economically empowered, and this is a human rights. We have it in many other countries, and it does has an effect on population growth and enabling girls to stay longer in school and to have those economic empowerment choices is definitely something we are looking at, as well as the climate education in itself. So effectively making sure that the young generation is sensitive to climate issues and looking at that as actually an opportunity to specialize into jobs of the future that will involve climate. So it cuts both ways. The health and education angle really are complementary to each other. And we're seeing that technology is really a driver of that. When we look at investing in a pharmacy chain, well, the pharmacy is where women and girls get most of the healthcare information. And we've seen, for example, the ability for women and girls to be able to buy online when this topic is still very taboo in the countries we invest in. And they're able to buy online sanitary pads, reproductive health products and services, family planning in the comfort of their homes without having to go out to the pharmacy and buy these products in sight of everybody else. So we've seen technology definitely also being a driver, and just us being much more conscious about we're not just investing in a pharmacy, we're investing in a place where the community gathers, where healthcare information is shared, and where more products and services that are tailored for young people and women can be funneled through effectively. So that's just one example of how we would look at a pharmacy investment, perhaps a little bit differently than others.
No, I think that's actually a great example. It brings it down to something that's real to several members of our audience, I'm sure. And maybe just touching on that, we could stay with that example quickly, but would you say that let's say in the pharmacy context, are those types of investments within your investment philosophy structured differently than a traditional private equity investment, for example? Or how are the drivers in your market influencing the financial mechanics of how you're going to go about delivering on your investment strategy, so to speak?
Yep, that's a good question. So if we look at Project Blue in Rwanda, it is a chain of pharmacy, and we would structure it like any other investment from a structure investment perspective. It has to be a good investment first. However, there is that additional value addition. So we look at gender and climate as enhanced value addition on top of what we would normally do for any investment. So as you can see, we would look at the ticket size, the instruments, the holding period, the exit strategy, how we source businesses that we want to invest in. Of course, even at the sourcing stage, because we're a thematic fund, we are going to source differently. We are going to be much more precise about which opportunities have the greatest levers for young people and women, and we narrow down for each of the sectors what products and services have the greatest potential for young people and women. We would look at the investment thesis and the quality of the investment on its own merit, and then what additional value addition we can bring. And this is where a lot of the climate and gender work starts. And it also drives who we invite as co-investors. For example, we recognize that Rwanda was still very dependent on buying very expensive branded medication. And we're coming into this transaction with a manufacturer of generic drugs, a local manufacturer in Africa. And that will save people money that they can then reinvest in education and in other sectors. And we look at the reproductive health, family planning, feminine care products differently. And so that's embedded in who we work with as co-investors, what additional value we want our co-investors to bring. And I think it takes also like selecting good management teams that understand this is an opportunity, understand this is a market opportunity to do better by young people and women. It's good for gender and climate. It's also good for businesses. Is the message out there, and we try to select also management teams that embrace that. Thanks.
Well, I think that it's quite poignant that you're using a healthcare example, because I think in our current context now of pursuing everything in all sectors in a post-pandemic environment, I'm sure that that impacts how we go about that, or maybe not. And so I was hoping to maybe pose the same question to both you and Jessica, but how about Jessica, I'll start with you. And this would be around, and you can build on Sandrine's example, but what are some of the tailwinds that you're seeing in the thematic space because of COVID? And are there specific sectors or themes, speaking even to the pharmacy example that Sandrine gave, that offer more opportunities in a post-pandemic context for thematic investing? And if you think there's more that can be done. And Sandrine, same question to you as well, if you want to give some thought to that.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how mindsets have changed during the pandemic, because it's only been a couple of years, but we took, for example, within the Text Collaborative, we took stock of where our members stand with regards to investments in the care economy. And that was in the early days of the pandemic. So May 2020, we did research among our members on this and had like a number of roundtable discussions to really understand what have they done in the past to focus on the topic of care and how are they thinking about the huge opportunity of the care economy. And at that time, there were some early examples of, for example, working with investee companies in any sector to tackle childcare, to think about redistributing the unpaid care burden that still largely falls on women and girls. So there were interesting examples of kind of applying a care lens to how you were working with investees. especially on the technical assistance side. But there were almost no examples of real investments into care economy businesses. And also a lot of uncertainty, is there even a market? What does it look like? Fast forward, the pandemic has really put a spotlight on the opportunity of the care economy. And it's really exciting to see all of the initiatives that are coming up, how investors are really interested in that kind of pipeline and understanding the investment opportunity. And together with Gendersmart, who are our co-partners of the CHEX Collaborative, we launched a care economy community of practice, or like an initiative and a working group. That's part of a bigger initiative. And so we're focusing on the investors. There's another group focusing on the pipeline and incubating businesses, and then we're bringing them together. And that is, for example, a huge tailwind that I see. I think, care economy was always there, but nobody really paid attention, and COVID has put a spotlight on this. And that's a major new investing theme that we see across our members and the broader market. Then also definitely the nexus between gender and climate, just what Sandrine mentioned. Project Drawdown, for example, has been really insightful for many who had previously just focused on the environmental side, but seeing, for example, the big impact on climate that, kind of a key lever for climate action that educating girls and promoting reproductive rights represents. That was something that wasn't really, there wasn't really awareness until Project Drawdown made that calculation. And we see a lot of interest in investors trying to understand how they can invest in the healthcare sector, for example, but again, with the gender lens, so focusing specifically on reproductive health, for example, and linking that to reproductive rights and access for women and girls. So that's another interesting one. And then, of course, everything to do with the future of work and education, green job, the just transition. How can we create more inclusive and resilient economies by really having that diversity and inclusion lens in everything we do and be very intentional about it? That's a major shift that we also see. And it's particularly interesting to see how some of the more commercially oriented investors have really pivoted. So they are now, thinking in the most innovative kind of ways of creating new funds, new financing instruments to take advantage of these opportunities and shaping the post-pandemic world.
Thanks, Jessica. Sandrine, do you have anything you want to add on the tailwinds?
Yeah, I think tailwinds in the post-pandemic and in the current geopolitical context that we're experiencing, I think in our sectors is really felt. In the food sector, we're looking most likely at a food crisis for this year and next year in Africa, and that is because of the reliance of Africa on food imports. So Africa imports about $35 billion every year, and the number 3 exporters of wheat to Africa, which is a daily staple food, is Russia, France, and Ukraine. So there's about 30 to 40% of the wheat which is off the global markets, and that will be sorely lacking for Africa. And the rains have been also really bad this year. And obviously farmers in Ukraine will not be planting for next year. So it's likely over the short term, we are likely to see a food crisis. But this is also an opportunity to actually say, well, now is the time to invest in local food production. We've seen some beautiful examples in our portfolios of aquaculture businesses that are good for the environment, good for making fish protein cheaper than chicken protein, and also filling in a particular malnutrition aspect for young children. Doing extremely well over the last 5 years, and especially during the pandemic when East Africa was not able to import frozen fish from China. And that local company went from $30 million in revenue to $60 million in revenue during the pandemic. So we've seen these examples that actually local food production and doing it in a climate conscious way will be the drivers of growth and jobs. It's an opportunity. And Africa has so much arable land and water and resources that it could use. It's often a lack of agro-industrial capabilities and processes and investment flowing to the sector. So we definitely want to put that sector on the map. Healthcare, obviously, we've seen more investments going into healthcare, also on the continent in a post-COVID environment. I would say education is maybe the one I'm a little bit worried about in a post-COVID environment. We are seeing development finance institutions putting the education sector on exclusion list at the same level as fossil fuels. So that is a blanket move in a way that really doesn't discriminate. We've seen a lot of failure in education investment at the base of the pyramid, especially. But putting the whole sector on an exclusion list because of an ideology that it should be the government and not the private sector is really a perception gap bias between Europeans and Africans. African governments are asking for private capital to come into the education sector. And we were one of the first teams that also put the numbers together when the UN Education Commission was created. We're looking at 1.4 young people that by 2030 will not go beyond the first year of secondary school now in low and middle income countries. What does 1.4 billion uneducated, unemployed young people do? That's the whole population of the African continent, effectively. So that is definitely a worry because we're not prepared. Education is less than 2% of capital in the world. It's less than 2% of foreign aid. And there's very entrenched views that it should be the government or it should be the philanthropist to build the schools in his village. But it is actually a sector that deserves investment. We talked about educating girls, definitely technology as a driver as well for gender equity and for equity generally in terms of education. We've seen beautiful examples in Africa during the pandemic of the first online blended learning with physical campuses and online learning for MBAs and undergrads. That company went from $17 million in revenues in 2020 to 49 in 2021. So it's a times 3 increase, providing young professional Africans the ability to have a degree that's accredited by a local university, a UK or US university, without having to leave their homes. So I think we've seen a lot of very good education investments, and we really need to tackle the perception bias that still exists in this sector. There's still a lot of work to do.
I feel like I could ask you a ton of follow-up questions in that regard, but Deborah, I'm conscious of the time, and I do want to give the audience opportunity to ask questions and participate. So maybe at this point, I would turn it over to you to handle the Q&A if there are some questions coming in, or if you have questions of your own, Deborah.
Thank you very much, Morgan, and Sandrine and Jessica for all the insights. Yes, so questions are welcome from the audience. You can either unmute yourself and share them directly to our speakers or put them in the chat box. I have one question to start with, and it's for Jessica. Jessica you mentioned that there are more traditional investors that are interested in the gender lens, but do you also see traditional funds that are showing interest in applying that kind of lens and are doing so today? Do you see there more and more coming, or is it coming in steadily and slowly? Do you see a change after the pandemic, that there is more interest in the gender lens focus?
Yes, definitely. And that is one of the very interesting learnings from the first 3 years of the 2X challenge. So I think probably most of people in the audience are familiar with the 2X challenge, but just quickly, it was the initial commitment made at the G7 summit in 2018 by the development finance institutions, initially of the G7 countries, and then grew to 20 DFIs and multilaterals. And it was this commitment to invest at least $3 billion with a gender lens by the end of 2020. And it was significantly surpassed, reaching $11.4 billion. And so what we really saw as a huge driver of that success were more traditional funds, so especially private equity funds, essentially, that were very intrigued by genderless investing, the opportunity, and also broader diversity and inclusion, and these mega trends at the intersection that we just discussed, and that have gone on this transformation journey. And in response to that uptake and demand, we launched the 2X flagship fund strategy. The 2X flagship fund strategy has essentially 3 pillars, but one of them that has been the most active so far are growth funds. So established private equity funds, fund managers that want to go on this transformation journey, and that for their new fund, so the latest one that they are raising, they are making an ambitious commitment to gender equality or gender diversity, both at the fund manager level and at the portfolio level of how they want to invest and work with their portfolio companies. And the status, the 2X flagship fund status, is given by an elected committee, the 2X flagship funds committee, that vets these funds based on the commitment that they make, sign an MOU, and then this also gives them some, kind of some support in fundraising, because they're really positioning themselves as a 2X flagship fund. That is based on a commitment. So these fund managers are traditionally, male founded, owned and led, but are making a credible effort within a reasonable time frame to really bring up women in partner positions, have a different carry allocation than in the past, so that there's also more gender diversity there. And then especially how they invest and how they do value creation to really leverage these mega trends and transform their approach to investing. So that's very interesting, and we've seen a lot of interest from traditional fund managers. At the same time, I would say, that in itself is not enough. I think it's one approach. It's a really important one. It's more of this mainstreaming approach, but it's quite different from what Sandrine described. And there are now hundreds of similar fund managers that are really coming up in the space across all markets, and are driving these gender first strategies, or really intentional strategies where it's not about mainstreaming, but really being intentional, and it's baked in from day one in everything they do. And importantly, they are, it also matters who founds, like who's the founding partner of a fund, because even if you are coming up in the pipeline as a woman and then you're also at partner level, it's still not the same as actually being the founding partner and creating the whole culture around it. So we want both. But those established funds, that's where we've seen most transformation. And now it's really about LPs backing this next generation of diverse and female-led fund managers.
Thank you, Jessica. Do we have questions from the audience?
I have a question. Sorry, I'm on. If it's okay, I'm really interested, Sandrine, in your last point around this lacking investments in the education space. And I'd be interested to hear a bit more of, in East Africa specifically, or in the markets that you are working in, are there particular ways that you think that this can be addressed specifically, plans that you have as EG Capital to fill that void, and or other funds, peers that you know about that are working to address that blockage, I guess?
Thank you for that. Indeed, I think two things we've done well. We've attracted a lot of private institutional capital as LPs into the fund. We have pension funds, insurance companies, banks from Africa, and also from Europe. Most private equity funds on the continent, I would say 80% of them are funded by DFI, which is public money. So we've attracted a lot of private institutional capital, which is a little bit more flexible in terms of what are we going to do, and allowing us to actually make investment in the education sector. I think to address the fact that DFIs and some DFIs have put education sectors on the exclusion list next to fossil fuels coming out of COVID, you think, really? But I think there's ways to circumvent and to navigate that environment. we can recognize and we can understand that there has been failures investing at the base of the pyramid, and there are certain reputational risks when you invest in education you need to cater for. So it needs to be done sensibly, but it can be done, and we want to demonstrate that through co-investors. So having co-investors that know how to operate and can take an equity position for a school, a secondary school, that's great, because we can do the working capital, the mezzanine financing without being the owners of the school. So there's still ways to bring capital to the education sector. And if you think about it, schools really need working capital because they've been impacted by the pandemic. Some of the parents were not able to pay the school fees, or their growth plan, their expansion plans to build more schools has been put on hold. So they need expansion capital and working capital, and we can structure that without taking a direct ownership stake in the school. And that could maybe be a solution to mitigate the fact that a lot of DFIs are putting education on the exclusion list, because there's simply a dearth of secondary schools in our markets. There's a lot of international aid that has gone the past 10 years to make sure that 95% of the kids have access to primary. Then it drops to 33%. Simply because there's not enough secondary schools. Parents, there's a very sticky middle class that is able to pay and that wants quality education for their children. The kids are smart. We just need to build more schools. And there's a need for private sector to come.
I don't have any more questions, Deborah, from my end, and I'm not sure the audience does. I don't know if you have others you would like to.
Please go ahead, Morgan.
Okay. I think Martina raised her hand, Deborah.
Please go ahead, Martina. Hi, Martina.
Hi. Yes, so I'm also still really intrigued by the fact that education seems to be on the blacklist together with fossil fuels. I can't get over that fact, even though you've just sort of outlined more on kind of the details of it. And I was wondering how we can make those linkages, those kind of intersection between education and gender, education and climate change, etc., stronger. And so basically it's a question for Sandrine and Jessica to kind of understand anything that you've seen that's really innovative in really outlining the intersectionality of gender and other topics such as education, climate change, etc. So I'd be really intrigued to sort of learn from your practical experience, if you can comprehend what I mean. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, happy to kick off and then pass it to you, Sandrine, for more context. So I personally haven't seen the education on the exclusion list as such, but I think it's possible that de facto it's the same, because they are de facto hesitant or careful to invest in the education sector. And I mean, coming, kind of from the microfinance and financial inclusion space and having seen a lot of, bad practices there, I can partially understand it. And I think the skepticism is especially around private equity and, the traditional private equity model, and then investing in bottom of the pyramid or social sectors like education. And if you just saw, these past days, there have been a lot of discussion again around the latest Bloomberg article on the debt burden related to cheap power. And so there's a lot of, there are a lot of, things and risks. Also, if you think about fintechs and some of those big stories that came out of emerging markets. But I think it's also partially a misconception around different fund models, right? Because if you have a cutthroat private equity model, would I recommend that you invest in education? Probably not, especially not in secondary education. But the model that Sandrine described is very different. So I think it's really understanding these nuances of different investment approaches, really balancing profit and purpose, right? If you're only out for profit maximization, then maybe you shouldn't invest in in primary, secondary education. But if you have a balanced approach and really, also an impact thesis, and you take that seriously, I think that's kind of the awareness raising and education work that's still necessary to open up investment opportunities in the private sector for these type of social sectors.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would just add that it is about doing it sensibly. We've seen terrible mistakes happen on education, where we see lenders coming in cutthroat to do a loan to a school in a slum that has never been profitable. Obviously, the loan should never have been made in the first place. So I think it is about doing it sensibly, where there is a market for it and where there are the fundamentals that do work, and understanding that for the base of the pyramid, you will need government, you will need NGOs to be active as well. But there's a part of the middle class who aspires to have quality education that needs to be met by the private sector, and we need to be able to invest in the sector. I would say also, like, education technology is another area where we should be able to do a lot more, and also like combining health and education. So if we make an investment in healthcare, well, we need nurses and we need training of nurses, and that's education too, right? Vocational training. So these pockets we should be able to still invest.
And if I can just add to this, I find it very, very, very fascinating, because my experience is more Asia-centric, and especially in India. I've done a lot of work on education with AVPN when I was there, and I mean, there's such a large spectrum of different initiatives, different investors. Really, that returns continuum is used really heavily to kind of understand who's coming in at what point. Systems change is a huge topic. So in that sense, I found that very, very intriguing. So thanks for your answers on this.
Thank you, Martina. Kalyani, you have a question? Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Deborah. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Yes, thank you for the presentation, Sandrine, Morgan, and Jessica. So just a little bit of context on myself. I'm from Will Grow Innovations Foundation, and I work as an analyst with their diversity and inclusion team. So it is just recently that we are a social incubator. We support enterprises in India that have a social impact. And it is just recently, by recently, I mean in the last 2 years, that we've been trying to build, support our enterprises, build a gender lens into the businesses that they are offering. So my question to the team is, given your experience working with gender lens investing, how can we as an incubator support our enterprises in building a business value around the gender, gender inclusion in the work that they do? And the enterprises that we're working are very, very early stage. So they just have a product in market, just starting, to build traction on the product sales. So my question is, based on your experience, do you have any strategies that we can, support our enterprises with in building a business value around gender inclusion?
Sandrine, do you want to take the question, or?
Yeah, perhaps Jessica, do you want to go first?
I'm afraid my internet just cut out towards the end of the question. If you could, Deborah or Kalyani, if you could just quickly repeat the question, please.
Sure. So I was asking, how can we build a business value around gender inclusion for the enterprises that we are working with? And the enterprises we're working with are very, very early stage for-profit startups who are just entered the market, and they have like a very, very small team, and most of the deployments are in rural India. So just wanted to understand your thoughts, and if you can suggest possible strategies we can keep in mind to build a business value around this. Yeah.
Okay, great. Now I got the question. Thank you so much. And it's a really interesting area where you're working. We've been in really interesting discussions, and also had a few pilots with accelerators and incubators on how to make them more gender smart, or to really, leverage the opportunity of working with very early stage companies where you still have the possibility to shape so much. So how can you help them be very intentional from how they build up their team, how they develop their products, and explore new market opportunities. And it's in many ways it's much easier and more impactful to do it in the early growth stage rather than work with traditional businesses and kind of go from one change initiative to the next change initiative. So I think that's really exciting. I'd be happy to point you out to a few accelerators or programs and pilots where we've tested this and discussed it and explore this further. But I think there are a lot of opportunities. And one thing that might also be interesting for you is Renew, who's a fund manager based in Ethiopia. They've been developing an interesting toolkit for SMEs, but you could also probably apply it to the rural India context and to startups, and how you can embed the gender lens and the impact lens into how you work with these companies. So, it's not kind of a separate module, but it's really a cross-cutting theme in everything. So when you talk about management practices and internal policies and practices, when you talk about sales and marketing and product design, so it's really cutting across all of the accelerated topics that you would have. And happy to connect with you afterwards and share a few resources or to make them available in the chat if it's useful for others as well.
Thank you, Jessica.
That would be really helpful. Thank you.
We have time for one last question. It's in the chat field. I don't know if Mette, you want to share the question yourself. If you can't, happy to read it out loud to Sandrine and Jessica. She's asking a quick question. Do you either of you utilize beyond growth and profit success criteria when evaluating potential investments and corporations?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that question from Mette. We look at more than just profit and growth when evaluating investments. That's why we're a thematic fund. There are certain goals that we are looking to achieve. It starts with profits and growth because that's also impact. Let's not forget that building financially sustainable companies are creating jobs. And that's a lot of, that's often very thought after lever is to create job and economic empowerment. So yes, we look at profit and growth, but there's so many other goals behind that. We have a framework where we have 5 objectives at the fund level that we seek to achieve as a thematic fund. And I think that's the beauty of being a thematic fund as opposed to a generalist, is that you're much more intentional at the outset in terms of why are you being even created as a fund, as a product? What is the product meant to achieve? And it definitely goes beyond profit and growth. There's that aspect of climate change, gender equity, and across the sectors that we want to invest in as well, we have specific sector specific as well goals. So the answer is yes. However, we are still an investment manager, so we will definitely also start looking at profit and growth.
Thank you, Sandrine. We are at the hour. Thank you, everybody, for participating in today's sessions, and a huge thank you to Jessica, Sandrine, and Morgan for sharing your insights. If anyone in the audience knows anyone in the network that should learn about EG Capital or about the 2X collaboration, please make sure to connect your network with our speakers today. I'll be sharing this network, which you are welcome to send around for people that are interested in the content, and I'll be also sharing our speakers' contact details so you can follow up directly with them. I thank you all for joining us today online, and I look forward to seeing you at another IFB session. Thank you to our speakers, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks so much, Deborah.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Sandrine and Jessica.
Thanks so
Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye, everyone.